In the winter of 1981, on the docks at Long Beach, California, there were rows of brand new cars sitting out in the open air. Stainless steel bodies, gull-wing doors, $25,000 each, and nobody coming to collect them. Hundreds of them, parked under the sky, quietly gathering salt off the Pacific, 4,000 miles away, on a patch of bog on the western edge of Belfast. The factory that built those cars was still running. That year, it had produced 7,500 cars and sold 3,000, and the man in charge had just given the order to double production. That sounds like a decision made by somebody who had lost his grip on reality. John DeLorean was a lot of things, and before this story is over, a jury will have something to say about most of them. But he was not a man who could not read a sales report. He had run 2 divisions of General Motors before he turned 45. He knew exactly what those numbers meant. He kept building anyway. By the end of this video, you will understand why a company would go on manufacturing cars that nobody was buying, and why the real answer has almost nothing to do with the scandal everyone remembers. John Zachary DeLorean was born in Detroit in January 1925, in the city that built the American century out of sheet metal. He joined General Motors in 1956 for $16,000 a year as an assistant to the chief engineer at Pontiac. 5 years later, he had that engineer's job. What happened next made him famous inside the industry. In 1964, Pontiac released the GTO, and DeLorean received almost all of the credit for it. The Firebird followed in 1967, the Grand Prix in 1969. In 1965, at the age of 40, he was made head of the entire Pontiac division. Nobody that young had ever run a division at General Motors. He did not look like the men around him. He wore his hair long, he wore his shirts open, he dated actresses, and he said out loud, in public, things about Detroit that the other executives only said behind closed doors. On the 15th of February 1969, they gave him Chevrolet, the largest car division in the world, for $200,000 a year and bonuses that could double it. He was 44 years old, and the presidency of General Motors was in front of him. Everyone who watched him arrive at that job assumed they were watching the next chairman of the biggest industrial company on earth take his final step, but one. He lasted 4 years in it. On the 2nd of April, 1973, at the exact moment the prize was closest, he walked away from all of it. The official version was that he wanted to build something himself. The version the people around him told was that he had grown to despise the way the place made decisions, by committee, slowly, and always in favor of whatever had worked the previous year. What he wanted instead was his own car, not a variation on somebody else's platform, but a machine built from the first bolt around his own ideas. He founded the DeLorean Motor Company in October 1975. The car had a working name before it had a factory. They called it the DMC-12, and the 12 was not a model number or an engine size. It was the price, $12,000. That was the promise. A genuinely exotic sports car for the money an ordinary, well-paid person could actually find. The body would be brushed stainless steel, unpainted, so it would never need repainting and would never rust. The doors would open upward. Giorgetto Giugiaro started drawing it in the spring of 1975, and the first prototype was finished in October 1976 by his chief engineer, Bill Collins. Then reality arrived. The car needed to be almost completely re-engineered before anybody could build it in volume. And that work went to Colin Chapman, the founder of Lotus, who threw out most of the unproven ideas and replaced them with a steel backbone chassis and the methods Lotus already knew worked. The design was solvable, the money was not. Starting a car company from nothing needs roughly $200 million. And in the late 1970s, there was nobody in America willing to write that check for a man who had just walked out on General Motors. He raised what he could. Some of it came from Hollywood, from people who liked the idea of owning a piece of him. Some of it came from the dealers themselves, who paid for the right to sell a car that did not exist yet. It was nowhere near enough, and every month it did not arrive. The car got more expensive to finish. So he went looking for somebody who needed him more than he needed them. He tried Ireland first. The plan was Limerick, and the Irish minister responsible, Desmond O'Malley, turned it down. He later described the whole proposal as all too good to be true. There was very nearly a deal in Puerto Rico, and then an offer came from the Industrial Development Board for Northern Ireland, and it was not really an offer about cars at all. In 1978, Northern Ireland was 10 years into the Troubles. In the part of West Belfast, the British government had in mind unemployment was running above 21%, and unemployed young men were the raw material of the violence. London wanted jobs there. It wanted them badly enough to pay almost anything for them. Between July 1978 and February 1982, according to the audit report written afterwards, the government provided assistance totaling some £77 million. Construction began in October 1978 on a site called The Cuts in Dunmurry, on the southwestern edge of the city. 6 buildings, 660,000 square feet, built on a bog in 16 months, and built deliberately on the line between the mainly Catholic estate of Twinbrook and the mainly Protestant one at Seymour Hill, so that the men and women walking through the gates every morning would be walking in from both sides at once. At its peak, the plant employed 2,600 people. And here is the thing that everybody misses about that money, because it looks like an investment, and it was not one. It was an employment program. Its success was never going to be measured in cars sold. It was measured in people working. That distinction sounds like paperwork. It decided everything. The project was set up on a projection that the factory would be filling orders for 30,000 cars a year. The company's own break-even point, the number it had to reach just to stop losing money, was somewhere between 10 and 12,000. Across the entire life of the DeLorean Motor Company, it sold around 6,000. So before a single car existed, a plant had been built at a scale that the market for a $25,000 two-seater never came close to justifying. And it was staffed, by design, with people who had never built a car before. Many had never had a job at all. That was not a mistake. That was the entire point of the project. But it had a cost. The earliest cars needed as much as 200 hours of rework in the company's own quality centers in America before a dealer was allowed to touch them. Every one of those hours was money. The car that had promised to cost $12,000 went on sale at $25,000, and a year later at nearly $30,000. Now look at what slowing down would have meant. Cutting production meant cutting jobs, and jobs were the only thing this project had ever been funded to make. For a few months, none of that mattered, because the thing actually worked. The first production car was presented on the 21st of January 1981, and the demand at the start was real. There was a waiting list before anyone had driven one. Buyers were paying over the asking price to get near the front of it. October 1981 was the best sales month the company would ever have, 720 cars. Then the floor gave way. America went into recession that winter. Interest rates climbed, and a stainless steel toy for $25,000 became the single easiest purchase in the country to postpone. Reviewers were not helping either. The company said the car went from 0 to 60 in 8.8 seconds. Road and track measured 10.5. It looked like it had come from the future, and it drove like something rather ordinary. Sales fell away through the winter, and this is the point where every normal company slows the line. DeLorean did the opposite. Instead of reducing output, he doubled it. By the end of 1981, the factory had built 7,500 cars and sold 3,000. In January 1982, it sold 350. Think about what that gap actually looks like on the ground. 4,500 cars, each one finished, inspected, shipped across the Atlantic, and then parked somewhere to wait for a buyer who was not coming. That is not a bad quarter. That is most of a year of a factory's entire output, standing still. If that still sounds like madness rather than logic, stay with me, because the next part is where the two become the same thing. By February 1982, the company was in receivership. What happened next is one of the saddest documents in industrial history. The company sent a telegram to all 343 of its dealers, asking each of them to buy 6 cars. Just 6. Not one dealer replied with an order. The unsold cars were everywhere by then, on dealer forecourts, filling the quality centers, and stacked in their hundreds on the dock at Long Beach. A share offering had already been canceled in January after the regulator questioned whether the company was viable at all. In March, the Bank of America sued over missed loan payments. At the end of May, the line in Dunmurry stopped, and then, on the 19th of October, 1982, John DeLorean was arrested in a hotel near Los Angeles Airport and charged with conspiring to traffic 100 kilos of cocaine worth $24 million in a sting run by an FBI informant named James Hoffman, a man he barely knew and against whom he had no criminal record of any kind. That arrest is the thing everybody remembers. It is also, for our purposes, almost irrelevant, and here is why. Hours before the police reached him, the British government had already announced it was closing the plant. The decision was made. The company filed for bankruptcy a week later, on the 26th of October. 2,600 jobs at the peak. About 70 remained at the end. The endings came in the wrong order for everyone. Colin Chapman died of a heart attack at his home in Norwich on the 16th of December, 1982, aged 54. Right as investigators began pulling on the thread of some $17.5 million that had been paid out for development work and had never reached Lotus at all. 8 days after that, on Christmas Eve, an American discount retailer that had bought the leftovers brought the workers back for a few days to finish the cars still sitting on the line, and the last DeLorean ever built rolled out of the factory. John DeLorean was acquitted of all charges on the 16th of August, 1984, on the grounds that he had been entrapped. He was acquitted again 2 years later of fraud and tax evasion. He had been right about the case against him, and it did not matter, because the company had been dead for 2 years. As for the money, the accounting went on for another 20 years. The department claimed £61 million from the receivers. It sued the company's auditors for $73 million and settled, in 1997, for $35 million. By the time the recovery process finally ended in January 2003, it had clawed back £40 million gross, spent almost £21 million of that on lawyers, and was left with a net recovery of under $20 million. The ordinary creditors, 600 businesses, owed around £14 million between them, were paid 4 pence in the pound. There is one line buried in that audit report that explains the whole story better than any of the headlines ever did. When the government was deciding whether to push its case against the auditors all the way to court, the independent reviewer warned that the other side had a very strong argument waiting. Their lawyers would simply tell the court that successive governments were so anxious to provide jobs in West Belfast that they would have carried on funding the project anyway, even if the fraud had been laid out in front of them. Read that again. The best legal defense available was that the money was never really about the cars. That is why the line kept running in the winter of 1981, with 3,000 sold and 7,500 built. Not because one man had lost his mind, but because he was standing inside a machine that had been designed, from the first day, to reward output and employment rather than customers. A business that is paid for what it makes will always make more than it can sell. Subsidy can build you a factory. It cannot build you demand. Somewhere in Dublin, a minister who had turned the whole thing down 4 years earlier was still using the same 4 words, all too good to be true. 3 years after the company died, a film came out with that car in it and made it immortal. Around 6,500 of them were still on the road decades later, worth far more than they ever sold for. The factory on the bog was making aluminum cylinder heads by 1989. If you want more stories like this one, every week, subscribe. And tell me in the comments which one you would rather run, a company that is paid to build or one that is paid to sell.